Welcome everyone. In this lecture, I'm going to be talking to you about all the steps necessary for starting your business. To begin with, let's just review some of the steps we've already talked about, and those include developing your vision of what your career is going to be like, developing a mission statement, developing your financial model, developing products and services, developing a pricing structure, and developing your business name and your brand. We've talked about developing legal contracts for managing your business proposals and client relationships. We've talked about developing customer service policies. So once you have everything ready to go, it's time to start making the necessary registrations for business licenses, checking your business name, and opening bank accounts and getting business insurance. And then ultimately, the operations of our business are dependent upon having really strong accounting practices in place for us. And we're going to be talking about all of that today. So one of the things we want to do before we start launching our business is we want to verify that our business name that we want to use isn't already being used by somebody else. It's kind of a first come, first served basis. And also we want to verify whether or not there is a trademark already placed upon a name that we want to use. And so I've got some links here for you to check out where you can do a quick search of the Secretary of State's website. You can do, there's a business licensing service that's available to you, as well as you can look at Department of Revenue Business Record Database. And you can also look up from the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office to see whether or not there's a company already in existence that already has a trademark on the name that you want to use. While this all sounds scary, in most cases, if your business name involves your personal name, it's likely that you can always find a combination of words that work well for you. I would even go a step further. Not only would I check out my business name, but I'd also start looking at domain names for websites to see whether or not my business name is available as my web address as well. And I might have to come up with some variations on that original business name idea to make sure I can kind of carve out my space both on the web as well as with my business licensing so I don't run into trouble later on. The next thing we want to talk about are the business structures that are available to you. A business is a legal entity. It can own property, it can hold bank accounts, and it's required to pay taxes. There are different types of business entities, and each one has its own unique benefits and limitations. So we're going to go through several of those. The first factor you want to consider is how many owners of this business do you anticipate having? Is it a individual, your business, and you're the only one that's going to own it? Is it a husband and wife team or a partnership? Or do you see yourself needing to have a larger group of owners that might invest in stocks and you need the formal qualities of a S corporation? So that's one factor to consider. The second factor is what types of owners are these? Are these business owners that are going to be active in the day-to-day operation of the company, or are they more of the case of just silent investors? So those would be some things that you'd consider. We want to know about liability concerns, and I'll talk more about that when we take a look at the different structures that are available to you. And we also want to consider tax implications. And there's other registration tax filing considerations based upon what business structure you select. For a long time, sole proprietorships were probably the most popular business structure out there, particularly for those of us that are starting a small business where we have an idea and we go into business for ourselves. A sole proprietorship is owned either by a single person or a married couple. And these businesses are inexpensive to form, and there's no special reporting requirements. The owner is personally responsible, which in this case means liable, for all business debts and for federal taxes. What happens with a sole proprietorship is that you file your personal tax return and you actually record your profit and loss from your business as part of your personal tax return. Today, I would say the most popular business structure for small businesses, and I would really consider us talking about micro-sized businesses, is probably the limited liability companies. also known as an LLC. These are very popular because they share some characteristics with a larger corporation in that they protect the owner of the LLC from direct legal liability, very similar to like a corporation, but it has fewer governance requirements. An LLC does require you to have an operating agreement on file with the state Secretary of State. What's really great about an LLC is that it also offers the ability to have what's called pass-through taxation, meaning that the business doesn't pay separate taxes. All the income tax associated with the profits of your LLC business pass through and are distributed to the owner's personal tax returns. So like a sole proprietorship where the business income earnings are recorded on the owner's personal tax return, the LLC is able to divvy up those earnings among all the partners, all the investors in that corporation, and pass it through to their personal income tax return. You can have an LLC with only one owner, so it offers greater legal protection than a sole proprietorship because it is a different business structure, and the LLC does protect in some instances from your personal finances from being impacted. Now, I am not a lawyer and I can't give you advice as to which route to go. I will tell you this. There are some practical considerations regarding choosing between a sole proprietorship and an LLC. If I am at the point in life where I am renting an apartment and I have very few assets and very little money in the bank, I'm probably going to go with a sole proprietorship because I have nothing to lose. And you can always change your structure from a sole proprietorship to a limited liability company later on as you go forward in business. However, if you're starting a business and you own your own home and you have some assets, then I definitely would be looking at an LLC structure because it offers additional protection of your personal assets as you go forward in business. The other business structures that are traditionally available are general partnerships, which are very much like sole proprietorships with more than one owner. Partners share managerial duties, profits, and losses equally. So when you have a general partner, each partner has equal control over the company, and each partner can encumber the rest of the partnership with debt or liabilities based upon the business decisions they make. This is why I really don't like general partnerships. I much prefer a limited liability company. With a LLC, you actually have somebody named as the manager, executive for that company, as opposed to a general partner where everybody's treated equally. Corporations are what we think of with large companies, and they're more complex structures than others. And as with LLCs, corporations have a tremendous protection against legal liability. However, when you form a corporation, you actually are dealing with needing to not only track the operation agreement, but you also have to track stock. And in fact, you have preferred stock, common stock. Basically, the idea is that corporations typically are for larger scale, more complex businesses. Corporations may choose a pass-through taxation if it's a very small, what we call closely held corporation. However, most S corporations that distribute stock, you have what's known as double taxation, meaning that the corporation is itself considered a legal entity, and in fact corporations have been ruled by the Supreme Court to have all the rights of individual human beings as citizens, and so the corporations themselves actually pay income tax, and all the investors or the stockholders have to also pay income tax on any profit or loss that they make from their investment in that company. So corporations typically are known for their what they call double taxation, but they are a very necessary structure for large organizations. A limited partnership is not very common anymore because the LLC really fills that niche very nicely. But a limited partnership is where you have a group of partners where one person has the full management authority and the other partners are not involved in the operating decisions or the day-to-day decisions of that company. And so you see a limited partnership formed quite often in the past. It was formed when somebody took in a lot of silent partners as investors. You'll see this a lot with restaurants. Where you get a large group of people to pool their money, and then the managing partner is the one that actually opens and runs the day-to-day operations of that restaurant. Again, limited partnerships are not used very often because LLCs just offer up so much more legal protection for those types of businesses. I've posted this table for you in my lecture notes, and this comes from the Secretary of State's website that talks about Washington State business and organizational structure considerations. I would tell you that starting out, you're probably looking at either a sole proprietorship or an LLC, and frankly, my preferred method, it would be to set up an LLC. Now that you've decided on your business name and your business structure, it's time to start registering your business information with a variety of government agencies, ranging from the state to federal to your local community government. One of the decisions you'll have to make early on is, am I going to have employees, in which case I will need a federal tax ID to be able to report my employer security taxes? Or am I going to be a sole proprietorship and just keep everything with my social security number? Again, I'm just going to recommend that if you go with an LLC, then you're going to want to go ahead and get a federal tax ID number. I also want to share with you that there are a lot of scams out there on the internet. If you start looking up how to file a federal tax ID, you will be inundated with businesses that are going to charge you $100 to get a federal tax ID number. Don't do it. All you have to do is go to irs.gov and search how to file for a federal tax ID number, and you can do it yourself for free. So if you decide to set up an LLC, this is where you might want to hire an attorney and spend up to probably anywhere from $300 to $600 to set up your operating agreement, register all your paperwork, and just if you want no headaches and have somebody else do it, I would hire an attorney. One of the things you need to be aware of is that you may have heard people talk about registering corporations in states like Florida or Delaware because there's certain tax advantages. Don't do it. With an LLC, there's no advantages to doing that. And in fact, state law requires that if you're doing business in Washington State, you need to register your LLC in Washington State. And then what you also need to figure out for an LLC is you have the person that's responsible for the corporation is called the registered agent. And again, I have an LLC. I am the registered agent, and it's an LLC with only one owner. So that's not a big deal. You can do this yourself through a lot of research online. You can actually register an LLC independently. That's how I did it. But if you want to just get going and have it taken care of, I would hire a good business attorney to do that. So let's go back. We're basically only at this point talking about two different types of business structures. The first one would be the simplest, which is a sole proprietorship where you don't have to register anything with the Secretary of State. You just need to buy a business license. And then that gives you what's known as your UBI, your Unified Business Identifier Number, and you get that by submitting a business license application. If you're doing an LLC, I'm going to recommend that you set up the LLC and then you go and get your UBI number. I think there's two reasons why I think it's important to get a federal tax ID number. Number one, if you plan to have employees, you need to have an EIN so that you can hire employees and report their earnings and pay your employer taxes legally. So I think that's really important. The second reason I like to have a federal tax ID number is because when I do business with clients that pay me a substantial amount of money, typically they want to fill out what's known as a 1099, where they actually are reporting to the IRS how much they paid me. And I don't like giving out my social security number to individuals, so I rather give out a federal tax ID number for my business rather than surrender my social security number, which is very personal information that I'm very concerned about protecting. If you plan to sell any retail products, you will need to not only get your business license, but you will need to apply for a reseller permit. Also, you need a reseller permit in order to purchase supplies at wholesale prices. So, for example, if I go to the photo finishing lab and I want them to be able to sell me prints and other lab services without charging me sales tax because I'm collecting it from my client, then they need to keep my reseller license, a copy of that on file. And so I have to demonstrate that I am appropriately licensed to collect and charge sales tax so that they don't collect it at source. Otherwise, you end up paying sales tax twice. If you don't have a reseller permit, you're going to end up buying all your supplies at retail cost, not wholesale. And then it's almost like you're paying sales tax twice because you have to charge your client for the sales tax and record that sale, and also then pay the state, repay the state. All you're doing when it comes to sales tax is you're holding on to the state's money for a period of time, and you get a little bit of interest on it. But at the end of the year or the end of the quarter, depending on what your reporting schedule is, you're going to have to pay all that money to the state. So here are some links for where to apply for a reseller permit. Washington State has a really nice website that gives you all the information about sales tax requirements for photography specific businesses, and I've included a link in our module to that guide, and it deals with the issue of when do I charge sales tax and when do I not charge sales tax. Any tangible item or good that I sell, which can even include digital files, by the way, I have to charge sales tax, collect it, and remunerate that to the state at the end of the year or on a quarterly basis, depending on how much business you do. The state will tell you how often they want you to check in and pay that to them. When I was a full-time studio, I paid my sales tax quarterly. These days, doing it just as a side business in addition to teaching, I only report my sales tax once a year on an annual basis. Here's a list of the types of tax returns that the state will ask you for depending upon your business. Most of us will end up doing what's known as a combined excise tax. If you're a really small business where you're grossing less than $28,000 total and you're only collecting $2,000 in retail sales tax or less, you might just end up filling out a sales tax remittance form, as opposed to more commonly would be the combined excise tax, which is going to be the return that you use to report all your business income, your sales tax, your use tax, and your B&O tax. Here's the first page of a typical sales tax form. And again, it looks scary, but it really isn't, because now you can do it completely online and it's very easy to do. If your business is starting out and you have part-time or full-time employees, then you're going to have to register for unemployment insurance and industrial insurance, and there's different fees for that. Actually, most of it's free to register, and then you just pay it as part of your payroll taxes. And then if you're hiring employees, you're required to report all newly hired and rehired employees to the Division of Child Support, because basically the Division of Child Support manages any payments, or they set the pay scale of child support based upon the income level of the employees. So we have to participate in that if we hire any employees. I personally would recommend that we start out with using our vendors as our employees to begin with. So I always think of the lab as being my subcontractor employees that I don't have to pay any employer tax on. And so I try to outsource as much of my labor requirements as I can, because I have to tell you, if you get into employee taxes, you're going to need a whole nother level of accounting for managing that than what most of us are going to start out with. Here are some of the fees associated with registering for employer taxes. Unemployment insurance doesn't cost anything, and it typically takes about 3 weeks before you get approved, so these are all things taken into consideration. Industrial insurance doesn't cost anything to register for that, and again, it takes 2 to 3 business days to get approved for that. So it's kind of funny the way they list some of the fees. Your tax registration basically takes 2 to 3 days to get approval. There's no fee for the registration. However, as you'll see in a moment, you can register multiple trade names and you actually pay a $19 processing fee to get your original master business license. And then the Spokane general business licensing fees, we'll talk about that later. Each city charges a different fee for that. So here is an example of what your LLC registration looks like. And you can see that my original registration date was in April of 2012. Here is what a state business license looks like. And you can see that I had my LLC registered first. And so my business license was issued in the name of my LLC. And you'll also notice that I have 5 registered trade names. So I paid $5 a piece to register those trade names because I have different lines of businesses. So I've got a publishing business, I have a consulting business, I have a fine art business, I have a general photography business, and I have a portrait business. That allows me to set up a bank account in the name of any of those businesses, or in the case of working with my bank, I have one business account under the LLC, but I can accept payments in any of those business names. So a client could write a check to me from Portraits by Ira, and I can actually put that into my business account that's registered under Gardner Media Group. So trade names are useful things. This is a little bit blurry, but this is the reseller permit. Those are effective for a 2-year period, so I'll be renewing mine in the next couple of weeks, as a matter of fact. I like to point out that the reseller permit tells you that you cannot use a reseller permit to purchase items for personal use or household use, and you can't use it to purchase your promotional items or gifts. Anything that you are not reselling, you cannot avoid paying sales tax. In fact, what's interesting about that is when you file your combined excise tax form, you actually, if you didn't pay sales tax for, say, a camera that you bought online from New York and you didn't have to pay sales tax, guess what? When you record your B&O tax and your sales tax, you're going to pay what's called a use tax for using that equipment in your business. And you have to report that because it affects your overall depreciation cost in your business, and it affects the overall reported assets of your business as well. So you're not going to get around that. You're going to end up paying what's called a use tax, which is essentially sales tax that you didn't pay initially, but you're going to pay it to the state as part of doing business in this state. Here is the fee structure for the City of Spokane. You will pay a license fee of $113 annually. And then if you have employees, you pay an additional $10 for each of your first 5 employees, and $15 for more than 6 through 10, and $20 if you have 11 or more employees. The theory there is the bigger the business, the more they want to make money from you. If you're a nonprofit, you pay about half that, so and there's no employee fees on that as well. What's nice about the City of Spokane is they tell you that there's some basic fire safety requirements for all new businesses, and if you're a home-based business, you really want to pay attention to the rules that govern home-based businesses. There's a maximum size of a sign that you can have in a home-based business. You can't have regular storefront hours to have people driving into the neighborhood excessively. You also have to check to make sure there aren't any what we call covenants on the property you own that prohibits business activities. I will tell you, years ago, there was a property available on 29th and Mantle Boulevard, which is my favorite street on the South Hill of Spokane. I went to investigate the possibility of buying this property that had 2 lots, and it had a house and a secondary building on it that would have been a fabulous studio environment. What I ended up finding out is that there were covenants on that property that prohibited any business activity taking place on that property. And those covenants are put in place by the original property developer. So you could have covenants from, if your home was 100 years old, you could have covenants from 100 years ago that you have to abide by. Now, the reality is is your neighbors are going to be the ones that investigate the covenants if you don't. Because if they don't like the extra traffic coming through their neighborhood, if they don't like your signage and they don't want you to have your business be so active in their neighborhood, they're going to look up the covenants on your property and they will report you and put you out of business. So it's very important, if you're doing a home-based business, check the covenants and check the rules and regulations that impact signage and hours of operations and how you can even promote your business on your website. For example, you cannot promote an address for your business that's a home-based business on your website, because that would encourage drop-by traffic into that neighborhood, and they don't want that. So just find out what the rules and restrictions are. Also, most home-based businesses, the IRS limits the maximum square footage that you can apply to a home-based business. I believe it's about 400 square feet, or 25% of the footprint of your home can be dedicated to a home business activity. Again, I'm not a lawyer, so I would definitely check these out before launching a business. You'll notice that different cities have different fees. The city of Spokane Valley only charges $13 for a business license and only charges a nonprofit $3 for a business license. And I'm not sure if they even have employee fees. So, but they do have some other requirements. In addition to a business endorsement, a home occupation permit is required for businesses that conduct any part of business from their home in Spokane Valley. A home occupation permit will be assessed if there is any exterior altercations to the resident, business deliveries, client visits, signs, or non-resident employees. So that, again, is just saying the same thing I've been telling you, which is check everything out before launching a home-based business. I will tell you that I had a dear friend of mine who's since passed away, had a business in the Valley that he actually had a full-time studio shooting room in his garage, and he left the garage door mounted to the garage, but actually you couldn't open it or close it because he'd framed it out and put this great studio location. And he was very considerate for his neighbors. He put his entrance to his business around the back, so there wasn't any seeing people coming and going, and he had a really nice location at a end of a cul-de-sac that just, he was kind of out there by himself, and he custom built this home and moved his business into that home after custom building it. So he looked at all the regulations and made sure he complied with that. When you first apply for your business license, they're going to ask if you're doing business in multiple locations. If you have multiple businesses, if you have multiple business locations in different cities around the state, they're going to ask you to fill out what's called a city addendum for each city that you are doing business in. They're also going to make sure what your primary business location is. So you're going to fill out a city addendum to delineate which city are you really doing business with. After you have all your business licenses in place, you have all your trade names registered, that's when you can finally open a business bank account. Couple things there I'll share with you. Number one, it's a really good idea not to commingle your personal checking and savings account with your business account. I really want to encourage you from the get-go to go out and register your business entity if you're doing LLC, get your master business license, get your reseller permit, get your city business license, get your trade names registered, and then go to your bank and say, I would like to set up a bank account. They're going to require all this paperwork. They're going to have a lot of registration forms for it. It's completely worth it because it's going to really help you out in the long term to have that separate business account. Remember where we talked about how you're going to have to collect and charge sales tax? You want to tuck that in a separate account and don't commingle it with your personal account. It's too tempting to think that you have more money in your bank account than you really do. I also want to tell you that when you're opening a bank account, don't be completely surprised if the banker actually offers you a line of credit. I was really surprised when I opened my first business account. The branch manager handled it personally, and in addition to opening a checking and savings account for my business, offered me a $10,000 line of credit attached to my account. And at that point, I wouldn't have loaned me that money, and yet they did it anyway. And I asked why they were offering it, and they said, well, every bank that does business in Washington State has to do a certain amount of community lending. And so one of the ways they did that was making small lines of credit available to small businesses. So the economy changes and the regulations for finance change. And so I don't know what it's like to start a business right now in terms of lines of credit, but definitely that'll be some of the things that you want to establish with a bank account, is get lines of credits to help smooth out some of the rough spots that you may have along the way. I found myself in my business, when I had a full-time studio, that $10,000 line of credit came in handy, because there were some months that were really short and there were other months that were really big, and so it just helped smooth out the rough spots. I always paid that account off every year. You never leave credit sitting there to amass a lot of interest debt. So these are just good budgeting and planning strategies for handling your money. When you have a business bank account, it makes it a little easier to handle some things like credit card transactions, and you also want to look at the convenience of the relationship you have with your bankers. I got to tell you, even though you may be doing business with a large corporate bank entity with hundreds of branches, you want to get to know your branch manager. You want to get to know your people, because they're part of your team. And I will tell you, just recently, I've had reason to go into my bank and talk with our branch manager, and we have a relationship that goes back over 30 years now. And I just value that so much. It's so helpful when people know you, trust you, and do business with you. Adjacent to getting all your business licensing and setting up your business bank account is getting business insurance. And there are a couple of types of business insurance you need to get and understand what they are. First of all is what we call general business liability insurance, and the other is making sure you're covered for health insurance in some form. Business insurance is also called commercial general liability insurance, and it protects you against losses due to bodily injury or property damage. There's different types of claims that can be filed against a business insurance policy. So when I had a commercial photography business, I needed to cover my clients' products that they were having me photograph in case I damaged them or they got stolen while they were in my possession. So that would be a property claim. Also, I needed general liability insurance. In fact, a lot of companies require that you have at least $1 million of liability insurance, because again, if I'm going to photograph on location, what happens if there's an accident and I drop a piece of equipment and it damages the manufacturing process for a company? They've got to shut their factory down for an afternoon. That could cost huge sums of money, and if it's ruled that it was my fault, my insurance is going to have to cover that, or I'm going to go personally bankrupt overnight. So I need that kind of liability insurance. As a portrait photographer, we also need liability insurance, because there are certain venues or parks where you're required to have at least $1 million liability policy to be able to photograph in that venue. Also, you want to be protected whether you have a retail storefront that people are coming in and out of, or you're having a home-based business. Don't think that your homeowner's policy is going to cover injury that happens when somebody trips on the sidewalk and falls in your front yard and has a medical emergency. You're not going to be covered off of your homeowner's insurance unless you have a business insurance rider added to that. So these are things to consider early on. Also, you need business insurance to cover your camera equipment and your studio property as well from theft. And you want to have it covered whether you're in the studio or somewhere else, or even if you leave it set up somewhere. I used to set up for a week at a time at certain clients' businesses where I'd leave all my lights and camera gear and I'd go work there for the week. I need to have my equipment covered all the time, and including when I'm traveling. So these are some things to keep in mind when you're shopping for business insurance. The first place I recommend going to is to go to your trade association. In my case, I can't recommend highly enough Professional Photographers of America as being the very first trade group I would join, and take advantage of their special rates on business insurance and liability insurance through PPA. It's a no-brainer. It covers up to If you have less than $20,000 in camera gear, it's a great place to start because it's going to cover that no problem whatsoever. If your business starts growing in size, then you may want to work with a different independent insurance broker to get a more robust product than what you're going to get through the discounted trade association insurance policy. In that case, in my case, when I had a full-time retail studio, I had a policy through the Hartford. They're a company that does a lot of business policies as well. And again, you're going to want to talk to an insurance agent about this. But if you're first starting out, coming out of school, and you're barely getting started, you can't go wrong getting a PPA.com. You can't go wrong going to PPA.com, joining Professional Photographers America, and immediately taking advantage of their business insurance policy that they have available to you. If you're going into other types of businesses, be sure and look at, if you're going into commercial photography, take a look at ASMP and find out what are their members doing for insurance. That's the American Society of Media Photographers, or MPPA, which is National Press Photographers Association. All these associations have members that are in the same situation you are that need business insurance. I'd like to just reiterate one last thing about insurance and making sure you understand that your homeowner's insurance or even your renter's insurance will not cover business-related activity claims. And so you may have renter's insurance, but if you have a camera that's stolen out of your apartment and they can show that you have a business license, they're not going to cover that claim. So you want to make sure you get special insurance to cover your gear. Depending on the size of your business, you can add an endorsement or a rider to your existing homeowner policy, or you can buy an independent commercial liability insurance policy as well. Here's a list of coverage options. You can add property coverage that protects buildings, inventory, equipment where you operate your business. You can have property coverage that protects inventory and equipment if you lease the building, and the landlord's responsible for covering the building itself. You're just covering your inventory and equipment. You can have liability coverage if somebody gets hurt or property damage occurs related to the customer. You can have business interruption coverage, where if something puts you out of business, it covers all your overhead for the months while you're rebuilding or reconstructing your business. You can do an umbrella or excess liability policy if you suffer a particularly large loss. And then we can deal with employee health insurance and life insurance that protect you and your employees. I will tell you that when I had a retail studio, one of the things I did to protect my partners is I took out a life insurance policy that would cover all the expenses related to the business if I were not there to run it. So I had a separate life insurance policy that the coverage cost and the amount of coverage was based upon what I felt needed to be there to take care of the business should I not be there. Health insurance is probably one of the most expensive out-of-pocket costs for any small business owner. The Affordable Care Act certainly made health insurance a requirement for all of us, but also has changed the way the market works. And so you can do what's called a small employer market and buy directly from an insurance company. You can buy health insurance through an association, and you can also, many of us, like when I first started, my insurance came through a spouse. So if you have a family insurance policy, oftentimes you'll elect to not buy a separate health plan because you've got coverage through your spouse's family plan. These are all decisions you have to make, but just know that that's another reason why just starting out I'm probably going to work with independent subcontractors because I can't afford their insurance to begin with, and I'm going to have to build that into my business model to add those employees later on. So I think that's a good stopping point for part one of our lecture on starting a business. I think the next step for you will be to go to the State of Washington Business Licensing Service website, where you can go through a step-by-step business licensing wizard where it will tell you in a complete list of all the licensing requirements both at the state and city level for your business. I would also encourage you to take a look at the Washington State Department of Revenue Photography Tax Guide that goes over all the terms and conditions related to sales tax and B&O tax. I think we're at a good stopping point for this part of our lecture on starting a business. We've looked at the very important components to picking a business name and registering our business information with a variety of government agencies ranging from local, state, to federal government agencies. We've talked about getting the necessary business licenses, and we've talked about the very important topic of getting insurance, because that really is the difference between a professional and an amateur. And in fact, it's one of the most important selling points to my clients is to explain to them the risk involved in working with a photographer who is not a professional business person. If they're going to hire me, they're going to get a photographer that not only has years of experience, but also they're getting a photographer who's insured in case something goes wrong. And so I always ask a client, how important is this if something goes wrong, and are you covered? We'll see you again soon. Thanks so much for being here.